The smell of antiseptic and burnt coffee mingled in the air of my small clinic, a combination that had become the olfactory soundtrack of my life. It was almost 9 at night. Outside, the city was beginning to surrender to silence, but in here, I was still reviewing files. A neighborhood doctor in a hospital the great tycoons didn't even know existed. The buzz of the old television in the corner of my office was my only company, a habit I'd adopted to feel less alone on long nights on call. Usually the noise from the news was just that, noise. But that night, a story broke through my lethargy. It was the kind of report the news networks loved. The tragedy of the untouchables, proof that money couldn't buy everything. The camera showed the glass and steel facade of the St. Jude International Clinic, a temple of modern medicine I could never aspire to enter. And then, the face of a man who, despite his $1,000 suit, looked like the poorest man in the world, Elian Croft. I knew him from business magazines, a titan of technology, a man who had built an empire from nothing. But on the screen he was no titan. He was a broken father, pleading with the cameras for a miracle for his daughter, Olivia. And then, the journalist listed the symptoms, and the world stood still. My pen froze above the paper. The air seemed to grow thick and cold. Every word from the reporter was an echo, a ghost emerging from the screen and stabbing me in the chest. Intermittent fevers with no infectious pattern, sudden random paralysis lasting mere minutes, sharp erratic pains with no apparent neurological origin. It was the language of my nightmare, the vocabulary of my deepest failure. The report continued. They showed Dr. Sterling, the chief of medicine at St. Jude, with his impeccable suit and condescending smile. He spoke in impressive jargon about complex idiopathic pathologies and atypical neurodegenerative syndromes, a brilliant speech designed to say only one thing: we have no idea what's wrong with her. He mentioned they had ruled out hundreds of diseases, from the rarest autoimmune conditions to exotic toxin exposures. They had spent millions on tests, but Olivia Croft, confined to her luxury bed, remained an enigma. A living hourglass whose sand was running out, and no one knew why. I stood up and walked closer to the screen. They showed a photo of Olivia from a year ago. Her eyes shone with the vitality of youth. And next to it, a current image, a pale, fragile figure connected to a labyrinth of tubes and monitors. She was a flower wilting in slow motion. My hand trembled slightly. In my wallet next to my ID, I always carry a folded picture worn with time. I didn't need to take it out. The image was seared into my memory. The same smile, the same light in the eyes, the same brown curls. My Eleanor. I turned off the television with a sharp press of the button. The room fell silent. But inside me, an oath I had made a decade ago over the cold earth of a cemetery now screamed with the force of a hurricane. Dr. Sterling, with all his technology and prestige, was looking in the wrong place. He was looking at the body like a machine, but he wasn't listening to the story that body was trying to tell. I knew that story. I had lived it. I had lost it. This wasn't about fame or money or challenging the titans of medicine. This was about Eleanor, and about a promise. I wouldn't let history repeat itself, even if I had to tear down the walls of hubris with my own 2 hands. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Olivia Croft's pale face had superimposed itself onto the most painful memory of my existence, and both stared at me from the darkness of my room. The ghost of my daughter, Eleanor, had awakened. 10 years ago, I wasn't a doctor. I was an architect, a man who believed in blueprints, in structures, in things that could be measured and built. A man who thought, with an arrogance that now shames me, that the world was a logical place. And then, my daughter got sick. She was only 8 years old. It started with a fever that came and went without explanation. Then her hands would tremble. Sometimes, in the middle of a sentence, her legs would simply give out and she would fall, only to get up a minute later as if nothing had happened. The doctors, the best my modest architect's salary could afford, were baffled. They told us about viruses, about stress, about conversion disorders. Each diagnosis was a new hope that ended in a new dead end. I watched her wither. The light in her eyes, that infinite curiosity that was her essence, began to dim, replaced by a fearful confusion. I spent sleepless nights by her side, holding her hand, feeling the pulse of her life grow ever weaker. The beeping of the machines became the soundtrack to my failure as a father. Failure to protect her, failure to understand. She died on an autumn afternoon. The final diagnosis was so vague it was an insult. Multi-organ failure of unknown origin. Science, in all its magnificence, shrugged its shoulders and took her from me. Over the damp earth of her grave, I made a promise, a silent oath that redirected the course of my life. I left architecture. I left the blueprints for buildings that no longer made sense, and, at almost 40 years old, I went back to university. I immersed myself in medical books, not to be just another doctor, but to become a hunter, to hunt the nameless monster that had taken my daughter. And now, a decade later, that monster had a new name, Olivia Croft. The morning after the report, I arrived at my clinic before dawn. My mind was a storm of memories and data. I ignored my day's schedule and locked myself in my small, cluttered office. From a locked metal box, I took out the files I hadn't had the courage to look at in years. Eleanor's complete medical history. I spread it across my desk. Hundreds of pages of blood tests, MRIs, specialist reports. Next to it, I placed my hurried notes of what Dr. Sterling had said on television. It was like looking at two maps of the same cursed land. The symptoms, the progression, the baffling lack of biological markers, everything was identical. It wasn't a coincidence. It was an echo. For years, I had formulated a theory, a hypothesis born of obsession and grief. A disease so rare it didn't even have an official name. A syndrome in which a latent genetic marker, harmless to 99.9% of the population, is activated by a common environmental trigger, like a childhood viral infection. Once activated, the syndrome doesn't attack the body directly, but causes a cascade of microinflammations in the autonomic nervous system, creating systemic chaos that mimics dozens of other diseases. It is the perfect killer, a ghost that hides behind 1,000 masks and is never detected by standard tests. I knew this was the answer. It wasn't a hunch. It was a certainty forged in 10 years of solitary study and sleepless nights. I had the key, but the lock was in the city's tallest ivory tower, guarded by men like Sterling. My first impulse was to call, to scream my truth through the phone, but I knew it would be useless. Who was I? A doctor from a public clinic, with no relevant publications, without a last name that opened doors. They would treat me like a madman. I needed a plan. I needed a strategy. But first, I had to take the first step. I had to at least try to let them know I existed. I looked up the main number for the St. Jude Clinic. My heart was pounding, a mix of panic and icy determination. Each ring of the hold tone was an echo of the machines that had surrounded Eleanor's bed, a reminder that I was about to face the same wall of indifference and arrogance that let her die. But for Eleanor, and now for Olivia, I was willing to crash against it as many times as it took. The voice on the other end of the phone was young, efficient, and completely disinterested. She was the third receptionist I had spoken to in less than 10 minutes, a labyrinth of operators trained to be an impenetrable wall. Every time I mentioned Olivia Croft's case, the answer was the same, a click, and back to the hold music. Dr. Sterling is not accepting unscheduled calls, the last voice said with a boredom that cut like ice. This isn't an unscheduled call, I insisted, trying to remain calm. It's an urgent consultation regarding a patient. I am Dr. Elian Vance. There was a pause. I could hear the clatter of a keyboard. I don't see you on the list of consulting specialists, doctor. If you'd like, I can take a message. I gave her my message, knowing I had just thrown it into a black hole. I hung up the phone and looked at the walls of my clinic, the cracks in the paint, the worn-out furniture. Everything here screamed ordinary. How was my voice supposed to compete with the marble and prestige of St. Jude? I decided to change tactics. I spent the next hour searching for a direct email address for Dr. Sterling, a nearly impossible task. Finally, I found it in the archive of an old university publication. I wrote the most careful and concise email of my life. I didn't mention Eleanor. I didn't speak of my grief. I introduced myself as a general practitioner with an interest in atypical syndromes and suggested, as humbly as possible, that Miss Croft's symptom pattern was consistent with an unrecognized inflammatory syndrome activated by a specific genetic marker. I ended with a simple request, the opportunity to discuss my hypothesis for 5 minutes. And then I waited. The next 2 days were torture. Every patient who walked into my clinic, every child with a fever, every elderly person with a weak pulse was a reminder of Olivia. Was she getting worse? Was her body, like Eleanor's, beginning to give up while I waited for an email that would probably never arrive? Helplessness was a poison spreading through my veins, the same poison that nearly destroyed me 10 years ago. The reply came on the 3rd day. It wasn't from Sterling. It was from an assistant with a corporate-sounding name. The email was a masterpiece of polite condescension. Dear Dr. Vance, on behalf of Dr. Sterling, we thank you for your unsolicited interest in Miss Croft's case. We assure you that our multidisciplinary team has exhaustively explored all evidence-based diagnostic avenues. While we appreciate input from community physicians, this case requires the highest level of specialized expertise. We wish you success in your practice. Sincerely, the Office of Dr. Sterling. Community physicians. The phrase was a slap in the face, a euphemism for insignificant town doctor. They were telling me, as politely as possible, to go back to my neighborhood clinic and leave real medicine to the experts. I felt a wave of rage so intense I had to grip the edge of my desk. No, not this time. I was not giving up this time. I made a desperate decision. I drove to St. Jude. The lobby was larger than the entire ground floor of my hospital. White marble, abstract art on the walls, and a solemn silence that only money can buy. I felt like an imposter, my modest coat standing out among the tailored suits. I was intercepted at the reception desk before I could take 10 steps. You need an appointment to see Dr. Sterling, the receptionist said without looking up. It's an emergency, I said. They all are, sir. And then, as if fate had decided to test my resolve, I saw him, Dr. Sterling himself, stepping out of an elevator, chatting with 2 other doctors. It was my only chance. Dr. Sterling, I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the lobby's silence. He turned, first with surprise, then with barely concealed annoyance. I approached, my heart hammering against my ribs. Doctor, I'm Elian Vance. I wrote to you about Olivia Croft. I just need 5 minutes. He looked me up and down, his gaze assessing my clothes, my appearance, my insignificance. A tiny smirk of disdain formed on his lips. Ah, yes, Dr. Vance, he said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. I believe my assistant made our position clear. We are not in the habit of entertaining theories based on, well, whatever they're based on. We have the situation under control. But you don't, I countered, my voice trembling slightly. You're looking for a needle in a haystack. I know where the needle is. Sterling let out a short, dry laugh. Look, doctor, I appreciate your passion, but I've read your file. I know about your daughter. The blow was low, direct, and brutal. I urge you not to confuse a tragic personal history with a valid medical diagnosis. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual patients to attend to. He turned and walked away, leaving me there alone amidst the cold marble and curious stares. The humiliation was absolute. He hadn't just rejected me. He had used my pain, the sacred engine of my mission, as a weapon to discredit me. I stood there, in the middle of that temple of medicine, feeling the crushing weight of defeat. The wall wasn't made of hubris. It was made of granite, and I had just crashed against it. But as I turned to leave, The echo of his contempt ringing in my ears, an idea, a madness, began to form in my mind. If I couldn't get through the wall, if the king wouldn't listen to me, maybe, just maybe, there was a crack, a way to get to not the doctor, but the father. The drive back to my clinic was a blur of traffic lights and gray streets. The sterile luxury of the St. Jude lobby seemed to have stuck to my skin, a cold and foreign feeling. Every word from Sterling was a needle stuck in my pride, but the deepest wound was the one he had opened by mentioning my daughter. He had turned my love into a pathology, my grief into a symptom of incompetence. I felt rage boil in my chest, a rage so hot it almost choked me. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to give up. But then the image of Olivia Croft's face on that television screen returned to my mind, so fragile, so lost. And behind her, the smiling face of Eleanor in the old photo in my wallet. The rage didn't extinguish, but it transformed. It cooled. It solidified, becoming a slab of determination. Sterling and his arrogance were the wall, a wall of prestige, of protocols, and of pride. Trying to tear it down head-on was professional suicide. I had already proven that. But every wall, no matter how imposing, has a crack. And my mission now was to find it. The king wouldn't listen to me. The castle guard had thrown me out. I had to find a way to get a message inside, a message they couldn't ignore. And that message couldn't be me. It couldn't be Dr. Elian Vance, the community physician, whose passion was seen as a weakness. It had to be something irrefutable, something that spoke the only language a man like Julian Croft would understand, the language of patterns and evidence. I spent that night and all the next day without sleep, rummaging through the archive of my life, dusty boxes in the small storage room of my clinic, filled with years of obsessive research. And then I found it. A copy of a nearly forgotten publication, a low-circulation medical journal to which I had submitted an article 6 years ago. I had signed it with a pseudonym, E. Vance, fearful of the ridicule my theory might attract from the orthodox medical community. The title was Systemic Echo Syndrome, a theoretical model for undetected inflammatory pathologies. There were no photos, no flashy graphics, just 10 pages of dense text describing, with chilling precision, the cascade of symptoms, the progression, the way the syndrome hid from conventional tests. It was a police sketch of my daughter's killer. It was the instruction manual for Olivia's disease. That was my crack in the wall. Now, how to get it to Julian Croft? Sending it to St. Jude was useless. Sterling or his minions would intercept it and throw it in the trash. I needed a side channel. I did what I do best after medicine. Research. I dove into the internet, searching not for the tycoon, but for the man. I found articles about his philanthropic foundation, an organization dedicated to the memory of his late wife. And on the board of directors, I found a name, Evelyn Reed, his personal assistant for over 20 years. She wasn't a simple secretary. Articles described her as his shadow, his confidant, the gatekeeper of his private life. That was my way in. I scanned the article. I didn't write my name. I didn't ask for anything. I just drafted a brief, anonymous note with a single sentence. Mr. Croft, your doctors are looking for a fire, but the problem is a slow poison. The answer isn't in their machines. It's in this pattern. If you see your daughter in these words, you are a smart enough man to know what to do. I sent the email to the Foundation's general address, but with a subject line designed to be unignorable to an assistant like Evelyn. Confidential. A personal message for Mr. Croft regarding his wife's legacy. It was a shot in the dark, a desperate manipulation, but it was the only bullet I had left. The days that followed were worse than the ones before. The first wait had been tinged with naive hope. This one was charged with a feverish tension. It was my last card. If it failed, I had nothing left. Every time the clinic phone rang, my heart leaped. Every email that arrived, I opened with sweaty hands. Nothing. Silence. I began to think I had failed, that the email had been lost, or that they had read it and dismissed it as the ravings of a madman. The image of Olivia growing weaker tormented me. Time was running out. And then, on a Thursday evening as I was closing the clinic, my personal cell phone rang. It was a blocked private number. Normally I would never answer, but something, a hunch, made me swipe my finger across the screen. I answered, holding my breath. There was a second of silence, just the sound of breathing on the other end. Then a deep voice, full of power but tinged with an infinite weariness, spoke. "Am I speaking with Dr. Elian Vance?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement. My throat went dry. Yes. There was another pause, longer this time. I could hear the clink of an ice cube against a glass. "This is Elian Croft," the voice said. "You have my attention." Elian Croft's voice on the phone was not that of a business titan, but of a man at the last rung of desperation. It was deep, scraped raw by exhaustion, but beneath it all, I felt the steel of an authority used to giving orders and being obeyed. "My private office, at the Croft Tower, 1 hour," he said, and hung up. There was no pleas, no questions. It was a summons. I drove through the city's financial heart, a world of glass and ambition that felt completely alien to me. The Croft Tower rose like a needle of obsidian piercing the night sky, a monument to its owner's power. A security guard with an earpiece was waiting for me at the entrance. He didn't ask for my name. He simply said, "Floor 80 inches," and escorted me to a private elevator that ascended in a dizzying silence. The office was larger than my entire clinic. An immense window showed the city at its feet, a galaxy of twinkling lights. Elian Croft stood with his back to me, looking out at the urban landscape. He was taller than he appeared on television, with a presence that filled the room. He turned slowly. In one hand, he held a glass of whiskey. In the other, crumpled, was my article. "I've read this 10 times, he said, his voice echoing in the silence. "It's the first thing in 6 months that isn't noise. It describes my daughter with a precision that chills my blood. Now tell me, Dr. Vance, who the hell are you? And why are you hiding behind anonymous messages?" I stood my ground, though my heart was pounding in my throat. "I am a doctor who believes your daughter has been misdiagnosed." "All of my doctors are the best in the world," he retorted with a flash of his usual arrogance. "The best in the world are looking for a 21st century disease with a 20th century map," I said, my own voice surprising me with its firmness. "I tried to contact your team through official channels. I was dismissed. So I used the only channel I had left. The truth." Croft set his glass down on the mahogany desk. "The truth is a very expensive word, Doctor. Dr. Sterling assures me that you are a charlatan, a man with a personal trauma who sees ghosts where there are none. I knew Sterling would have tried to poison the well. Dr. Sterling is an excellent physician, Mr. Croft, but he is blinded by protocol. He believes that if a disease doesn't show up on his multi-million-dollar machines, it doesn't exist. I have studied this syndrome for 10 years. I know how it behaves. I know how it hides." Croft's eyes scrutinized me, trying to read beyond my words. It was a silent battle, my conviction against his skepticism. The silence was broken by the sound of the office door opening. It was Sterling, his face a mask of contained fury. "Elian, I told you this was a bad idea," he snapped, ignoring me completely. "This man is an intruder, an opportunist preying on your grief. What he proposes has no scientific basis. It's anecdote, intuition. We cannot risk Olivia's life on the hunch of an emergency room doctor. Your scientifically based methods are killing her slowly," I shot back, my voice rising for the first time. "You are treating her like a puzzle, but she is an hourglass, and the sand is running out." Sterling turned on me, his face reddening. "You have no authority here. You have no access to the data. You have no idea of the complexity of—" "I don't need your data, Dr. Sterling," I interrupted, my voice now cold and sharp, "because I have already seen this movie, and I know how it ends." Elian Croft raised a hand, silencing Sterling instantly. His gaze was fixed on me. The battle was no longer between Sterling and me. It was between doubt and hope inside a father's mind. Prove it, Croft said softly. How? Sterling asked, incredulous. I turned back to Croft, ignoring the other doctor. You are a man who believes in results, not theories. So don't believe me. Believe the disease. I paused, gathering all my courage. You don't have to give me permission to treat her. You just have to watch. This syndrome isn't chaotic. It follows a pattern, a predictable one. I leaned forward slightly. In the next 48 hours, Olivia will have a crisis. Her fever, which is now low and persistent, will spike sharply to nearly 104 degrees. During the peak of the fever, she will experience a temporary and complete paralysis in her left hand. It will last less than 5 minutes, and then, as quickly as it came, the fever will vanish, leaving her exhausted but stable. Your machines will have no explanation for the cause or the sudden recovery. It will be an anomalous event on their charts. The silence in the room was absolute. Sterling looked at me as if I were insane. Croft, however, had an unreadable expression. When that happens, I continued, my voice now a whisper, you will know that I'm not guessing. You will know that I understand what you're up against. Croft was thoughtful for a long minute that felt like an eternity. Finally, he looked at Sterling and then at me. All right, he said. 48 hours. I will give you remote access to Olivia's vital sign monitors. Nothing more. If you are right, you and I will talk again. If you are wrong— He paused and his voice turned to ice. I will personally see to it that you never practice medicine in this country again. I nodded, accepting the wager. Sterling looked ready to explode, but he didn't dare contradict Croft. The sand has started to fall, Doctor, Croft said as a farewell. I left that office feeling a cold vertigo. I had just gambled my entire career, my future, on the prediction of a disease the world didn't believe existed. But it wasn't a gamble. It was a certainty. The certainty that had cost me my own daughter's soul. Now all that was left was to wait and pray that, this time, the story would be different. The next 48 hours became a personal purgatory. My small office, which normally smelled of old files and stale coffee, was transformed into a makeshift command center. My laptop screen, remotely connected to Olivia Croft's vital sign monitors, was a window into another universe, a world of cold, precise data that cost more per second than I earned in a month. The first 24 hours were an exercise in silent torture. The lines on the monitor remained stable, almost mockingly normal. Olivia's temperature fluctuated by a few tenths of a degree, like any patient's. Her heart rate was regular. There was nothing. The silence of the data was a scream in my head. I began to doubt myself with a ferocity that chilled me to the bone. Had I been arrogant? A fool? Sterling was right. I was projecting the ghost of my own tragedy onto an innocent girl. Maybe Eleanor's symptoms had been an anomaly, a 1 in a million case, and I, in my grief, had turned it into a non-existent pattern. The career I had wagered now felt like a cliff I had already jumped from. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. I just watched the screen, with Eleanor's photo beside it, her silent smile judging me. Every hour that passed without change was another turn of the rope around my neck. The 48-hour deadline was approaching, and with it, the end of my credibility, my career, my last chance to give meaning to my daughter's death. With about 10 hours left, it happened. It was an almost imperceptible tremor on the temperature graph, a small ripple. I leaned over the screen, my eyes fixed on the green line. And then, it began to climb. Slowly, almost lazily at first, and then with a relentless resolve, 99.5, 100.4, 101.8. My heart began to beat to the accelerated rhythm of the graph. I didn't feel joy. I felt a cold terror. It was happening. My phone rang, a number from St. Jude. It was a nurse, her voice fraught with panic. Dr. Vance, this is Sarah from the ICU. Patient Croft's temperature is spiking uncontrollably. Dr. Sterling is on his way, but do you know anything about this? I kept my voice as calm as I could. Yes, I do. Don't do anything drastic. Just watch your left hand. Call me if you notice anything. I hung up. The fever continued to rise. 102.6, 103. The peak was 103.1, exactly as I had predicted. I imagined the chaos in that luxury room. Sterling shouting orders, nurses running, monitor alarms beeping, all of them searching for an infectious cause and a reaction, something, anything other than the terrifying absence of an explanation. And then my cell phone rang again. It was Elian Croft. His voice was a broken whisper of panic. "Her hand," he said, almost breathless. "Her left hand. It's limp. She's not moving it. She's not responding. What's happening to her, doctor? For the love of God, what is happening?" I closed my eyes, not out of fear, but to ground myself. "Wait, Mr. Croft," I said, my voice now the only source of calm in his universe. "Don't panic. It will pass. Watch. It will last less than 5 minutes, and then the fever will break." The call went silent, but he didn't hang up. I could hear his ragged breathing, the murmur of nurses in the background. They were the 3 longest minutes of my life. She's moving," Croft said suddenly, his voice cracking with astonishment. "She's moving her fingers." Oh my God! I looked at my screen. The temperature line, which had been a feverish plateau, suddenly plummeted. It dropped as quickly as it had risen until it stabilized back in the normal range. The crisis was over. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone, only the sound of a father's breathing, a father who had just witnessed something that defied logic. "My office," he finally said, his voice stripped of all arrogance, leaving only a naked vulnerability. "Now." When I arrived, the atmosphere was completely different. Sterling was not there. Elian Croft was alone, standing by the window, the glass of whiskey back in his hand. He no longer looked like a titan. He looked like an old, frightened man. He turned to me. There was no anger, no skepticism, only a question in his eyes. "How?" he whispered. "How could you possibly have known that?" I sat in the leather armchair he gestured to, and then, for the first time in 10 years, I opened the metal box of my memory and told him the whole story. I told him about my life as an architect. I told him about Eleanor, about her smile, her light. I described her illness, the same sequence of symptoms he had just witnessed in Olivia. I told him about our pilgrimage through hospitals, the confusion of the doctors, the desperation, the helplessness. I told him how I watched her fade away and the unbearable silence of the room when her heart stopped beating. I confessed the oath I made, the promise that her death would not be in vain. I described my return to the university, the obsessive nights of study, the years of solitary research, connecting dots no one else saw. As I spoke, I was not a doctor presenting a case. I was a father talking to another father, sharing a sacred wound that only the 2 of us, in that moment, could understand. When I finished, tears were streaming down Elian Croft's face without him seeming to notice. He remained silent, looking at the city, but not seeing it. "My God," he finally said, his voice broken. "All these months, Sterling and his team, they're blind, utterly blind." He came over and sat across from me. He looked at me, and for the first time I didn't see a tycoon. I saw an ally. "Doctor," he said, his voice heavy with a new and terrible certainty. "From this moment on, you have whatever you need. My resources, my power, they are yours. Just tell me what we have to do. Save my daughter." I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also, for the first time, a spark of hope. "The first thing we have to do, Mr. Croft," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "is get Dr. Sterling out of our way." The phrase, "get Dr. Sterling out of our way," sounds simple in an office 800 feet up, with the power of a multi-billion-dollar empire backing you. In reality, I discovered that the hubris of a system is harder to move than a mountain. Elian Croft acted with the speed and decisiveness that had made him famous. First thing the next morning, He called an emergency meeting with the hospital's board of directors. I was not invited. I waited in his office, feeling like a weapon being kept in its holster until the moment it's needed. An hour later, Croft returned. The fury on his face was so palpable I felt it like a wave of heat as he entered the room. "They're a pack of arrogant cowards," he hissed, pouring a glass of water with trembling hands. "They hide behind their committees, their protocols, their damned insurance policies." He told me what had happened. Sterling had defended himself with the skill of a cornered politician. He had presented my theory as dangerous pseudoscience, me as an emotionally unstable intruder, and Julian as a vulnerable father susceptible to manipulation. He had invoked the sacred Hippocratic oath, arguing that allowing me to treat Olivia would be criminal negligence that would risk the reputation of the entire hospital. He had won. The board, terrified of potential litigation and a scandal, backed Sterling unanimously. Not only did they refuse to remove him from the case, but they formally forbade me from having any contact with the patient. The door that had opened the night before had been slammed shut. "I'm sorry, Doctor," Croft said, his voice a murmur of defeat. "My money can buy companies, it can influence governments, but it seems it can't buy common sense." For a moment I felt the floor disappear from under me. We were so close. The answer was within reach, but we were being denied it out of pride and fear. Eleanor's story was repeating itself, but this time the indifference had a smiling face and a prestigious title. I stood in silence, looking out at the city, my mind working at a feverish pace. And then, an idea, born not of logic, but of the raw, grinding need to find a way, began to take shape. "I don't need to be her official doctor, Mr. Croft," I said slowly, turning to look at him. "I don't need your board's permission. I don't need Sterling's respect. I only need one thing." "What is it?" he asked, his interest rekindled. "I need access to your daughter, and I need your absolute authority to ensure that no one, not even Sterling, interferes while I'm in that room." Croft looked at me, instantly understanding the implication. What I was proposing was to operate outside the system, a forbidden alliance, an act of rebellion within the sacred walls of medicine. A slow, cunning smile, the smile of the man who built an empire by breaking the rules, spread across his face. "I like the way you think, Doctor." What followed was a silent display of power. Julian Croft didn't confront the board again. He simply went around them. He made a call to the hospital's director, a man whose cardiology wing had been funded by a generous donation from the Croft Foundation. He made another call to his legal team. 2 hours later, I had a new credential. It didn't say physician, it said family consultant. An ambiguous title that meant nothing and therefore meant everything. It gave me unlimited access to Olivia's suite under the direct and exclusive authority of her father. Legally, I was not practicing medicine in that hospital. I was there as an advisor, a friend of the family, a ghost in the official records. That evening, when I returned to St. Jude, the atmosphere was icy. Dr. Sterling saw me in the hallway, and his look was pure venom. He said nothing. He couldn't. But we both knew that the battle lines had been drawn. I entered Olivia's suite. Julian Croft was already there, standing by the bed of his daughter, who was sleeping a restless sleep. The room, with its luxurious furniture and cutting-edge technology, now felt like a bunker, our sanctuary, and our battlefield. "Sterling has given orders that every medication we administer be recorded, every procedure. He's watching us," Croft informed me in a low voice. "Let him watch," I replied, opening my briefcase. I hadn't brought sophisticated equipment. I had brought the compounds I had developed in my small lab, the notes from my research, the experience of a decade of pain. What we're about to do won't appear in his textbooks. Julian nodded, his face grim. "My daughter is in your hands, Doctor. All of my faith is in you." I looked at Olivia, her breathing shallow, her skin almost translucent. The weight of Julian's trust was almost as overwhelming as the wall of Sterling's contempt. I was no longer fighting just a disease. I was fighting against time, against a hostile system, and against the ghost of my own failure. The suite door clicked shut, isolating us from the rest of the hospital. The outside world, with its rules and its judgments, had disappeared. In that room, there was only a desperate father, a girl on the edge of the abyss, and a renegade doctor with a promise to keep. The forbidden treatment was about to begin. The treatment began in an almost religious silence. My briefcase didn't hold cutting-edge technology, but the result of a decade of solitude and study. A single vial containing a pale amber liquid. It was an inhibitory compound I had synthesized myself, designed to do one thing: turn off the genetic marker that, in my theory, was causing the chaos in Olivia's body. It was a biochemical key for an invisible lock. As I prepared the intravenous injection, I felt Elian Croft's gaze fixed on my back. He said nothing, but his silence was heavier than any scream. It was the silence of a man who has bet the entire universe on a single card. I administered the first dose slowly, my attention divided between the needle and the monitors that sang the monotonous melody of Olivia's vital signs. For the first hour, nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. The lines on the screens remained stable, indifferent. Elian paced the room like a caged lion. The silence grew denser, more accusatory. Doubt, my old enemy, began to whisper in my ear. Asterisk. What if you're wrong? What if this time is different? Then there was a glimmer of hope. Olivia's oxygen saturation, which had been stuck at a worrying 92% for weeks, went up a point, then another. It reached 95%. A sigh of relief escaped Elian's lips. It's working, he murmured. I didn't answer. It was too soon. It was a false calm, the stillness of the sea just before the tsunami hits the coast. And then, all hell broke loose. It happened without warning. One of the monitors emitted a sharp, piercing beep. Olivia's heart rate shot up, going from a stable rhythm to an uncontrolled tachycardia. Her body, until then limp, arched on the bed, shaken by a violent convulsion. Her eyes, though closed, moved erratically beneath her eyelids. The alarms on all the equipment began to sound at once, a shrill cacophony heralding disaster. "What's happening?" Elian shouted, rushing to the bed. "It's the reaction!" I exclaimed, my voice trying to rise above the panic I felt. "Her immune system is responding. It's fighting the compound. It's a good sign. It means we found the enemy." But my words sounded hollow in the face of the violent reality of what we were seeing. Olivia's blood pressure plummeted. The oxygen saturation alarm blared again, this time with a deadly urgency, showing a nosedive. Her body was collapsing. The suite door burst open. Dr. Sterling stormed in, followed by 2 nurses. His face was a mixture of horror and a terrible, triumphant vindication. "I knew it," he shouted, pointing at me. "You're killing her. Security, get this man out of here now." He lunged for the equipment, shouting orders at the nurses. "Prep a stabilizer. I need epinephrine. Elian, for the love of God, look at what you've allowed." The chaos was total. The nurses, confused, didn't know who to obey. Elian was paralyzed, his face a mask of terror, watching his daughter fade before his eyes. And I was reliving the worst nightmare of my life. I was back in that hospital room 10 years ago, useless, watching my daughter's life slip through my fingers. "No!" I shouted, my voice broken with anguish, stepping between Sterling and the bed. "It's the healing crisis. It's the poison leaving the system. If you stabilize her now, if you reverse the process, we'll lose her forever." "You're insane," Sterling shot back, in his face inches from mine. "You're sacrificing this child for your personal delusion. Get out of the way." It was Elian Croft who stopped everything. He moved, physically placing himself between Sterling and me. His body was a wall. He looked at the chaos of the monitors, the convulsing face of his daughter, Sterling's fury, and then he looked at me. He looked me in the eyes. In that instant, the decision wasn't medical or scientific. It was an act of faith, the faith of one father in another father's pain. Out, Croft said, his voice a whisper so low and so full of authority it froze the room. Sterling was flabbergasted. What? I said out, Julian repeated without raising his voice. All of you, out of this room. He stays. He pointed at me. This is my daughter, and this is my decision. Julian, this is madness. You'll be responsible for... Sterling began to protest. Now, Croft roared, and for the first time I saw the titan who dominated the world. The nurses backed away. Sterling shot me a final look full of hatred and left, defeated. The door closed. The silence that remained was almost as deafening as the noise before, broken only by the sharp beeping of the alarms. We were alone, Julian and I in the eye of the hurricane, with Olivia's life hanging by the thinnest of threads. He had given me his faith. Now I could only hope that with my wager, I hadn't condemned us both. The door closed, and the silence Sterling left behind was replaced by the deafening chaos of the alarms. The suite, once a sanctuary of luxury, was now an emergency room at the end of the world. We were alone, Julian, me, and Olivia's body, which was waging a violent war against itself. I had won Julian's trust, an almost irrational act of faith on his part, but that victory now felt like a rope tightening around my neck. He had given me his faith, yes, but if Olivia died, it wouldn't be from an unknown disease. It would be from my treatment. By my hand. The line between being a savior and a killer had become terrifyingly thin. Talk to me, doctor, Julian said, his voice an anchor in my storm of panic. Tell me what to do. His strange calm centered me. Nothing, I replied, moving quickly to check the IV lines and the monitors. We can't stop it. We can only help her body withstand it. We need to keep her hydrated. We need to watch her breathing. The next hour was a descent into hell. I fought minute by minute, not against the disease but against its side effects. I administered saline solutions to combat the febrile dehydration, adjusted the oxygen levels, monitored every spasm, every erratic fluctuation of the pulse. Julian remained in a corner, not moving, not speaking, his presence a silent testament to a trust that I myself was beginning to lose. The reaction was more violent than I had anticipated. Olivia's body was fighting with a fury that made no sense. My treatment was designed to neutralize a threat, but her system was reacting as if the treatment itself were the threat. Doubt gnawed at me again. Asterisk. What if Sterling was right? What if I am just a father projecting a ghost? I stared at the graphs on the monitor, my mind reviewing Eleanor's data over and over. The pattern was 99% identical. The same tachycardia, the same drop in pressure, the same febrile response. But there was something different. A small anomaly on the EKG, an inverted T wave that appeared intermittently, a subtle, almost insignificant detail. Sterling's doctors would have classified it as signal noise, simple interference. And then a memory hit me with the force of a lightning bolt. I saw myself 10 years ago in Eleanor's room during her last night. I was sitting by her bed, exhausted, looking at the same type of monitor. I saw the same inverted T-wave flickering on the screen. I had mentioned it to one of the residents, a young man with more confidence than experience. He glanced at it quickly. It's a potassium fluctuation, he had said dismissively. Statistically irrelevant in the midst of a systemic collapse like this. Asterisk. Statistically irrelevant. I stared at Olivia, and suddenly, I saw it. The piece I had been missing for a decade. The piece that wasn't in the books. The detail that my grief had prevented me from seeing. My theory was correct. The syndrome attacked the autonomic nervous system. But it wasn't just that. In certain patients, in those with Eleanor's and Olivia's genetic marker, the systemic inflammation caused a second reaction, a massive leakage of potassium from the cells. The body was literally emptying itself of one of the key electrolytes for the heart's electrical conduction. It wasn't cardiac failure, it was electrical failure. Eleanor's doctors had seen the effect, but not the cause. And I, in my obsession with the main syndrome, had made the same mistake. The treatment was working. It was killing the invader, but the battle was creating fatal collateral damage. "Mr. Croft," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm, the voice of absolute certainty. "I've got it. I know what's missing." Julian was by my side in an instant. "What is it?" "I need a potassium chloride injection, a high dose, right now." He was bewildered. "But Olivia's doctors said her potassium levels were normal in the last tests." "Because they measure it in the blood," I explained, my urgency growing. "The potassium is leaking from her cells, not her plasma. The blood tests don't detect it until it's too late. Your daughter's heart isn't failing. It's running out of the electricity to beat. It's the same reason I lost Eleanor." For the first time, Julian didn't hesitate. He ran to the room's intercom. "I need a crash cart in here now," he shouted, "and an ampule of potassium chloride." Sterling's voice responded, metallic and furious. "Julian, that's insane. A high dose of potassium with a tachycardia like this could stop her heart." "Do as I say or I swear I will sink this hospital," Croft roared. Seconds later, a terrified nurse entered with a small tray. She handed it to me, avoiding my gaze. I took the syringe. My hands were completely steady. The fear was gone, replaced by a crystal clarity. This was the moment, the chance that life or God or fate was giving me to rewrite the end of my own story. I injected the potassium into Olivia's IV line, and then we waited. For an instant, nothing happened. The alarms continued to scream. Olivia's body was still convulsing. Julian Croft's heart was beating so hard I could almost hear it. And then, like a miracle, the erratic line of the EKG gave a small jump and stabilized. The sharp, chaotic beeping transformed into a rhythmic beep, beep, beep. Steady, strong. The heart rate alarm fell silent. Then, the blood pressure alarm, as the pressure began to rise slowly but surely. And finally, the oxygen saturation alarm, as the number climbed, 96, 97, 98. The silence that filled the room was more profound than any sound. The door opened and Sterling entered, his face pale. He looked at the monitors, then at me, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. There was nothing he could say. The data, his only God, had just proclaimed a miracle that his science could not explain. The first light of dawn began to filter through the immense window, tinting the room a soft gold. The light fell on Olivia's face. Her body, for the first time in months, seemed to be at peace, relaxed. Julian Croft had collapsed into an armchair, his face in his hands, his body shaken by silent sobs. The storm at last was over. The darkest night had ended. The morning sun flooded the suite, erasing the long shadows of the night. The only sound in the room was no longer the chaotic scream of alarms, but the rhythmic, steady beep of Olivia's heart monitor. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, the sound of life, stubborn and victorious. Julian Croft was still in the armchair, but he was no longer crying. He was simply watching his daughter sleep, her face bathed in the dawn light, with an expression of awe and reverence, as if he were witnessing a miracle. Dr. Sterling and his team had vanished, defeated not by me, but by a truth they refused to see. I walked to the window, feeling the weight of exhaustion on my shoulders for the first time. It had been the longest night of my life. "It wasn't just the medicine, was it, Doctor?" Julian said in a low voice without taking his eyes off Olivia. I turned to look at him. "No, Mr. Croft," I answered honestly. "The medicine was the tool, the key. But something else opened the door." "Your daughter," he said, and for the first time I felt a deep connection with this man. We were both members of a fraternity no father would ever want to join. I nodded in silence. The weeks that followed were a blur of slow but steady recovery. I became a regular presence at St. Jude. No one looked at me with disdain anymore. Dr. Sterling was reassigned to an administrative position, a golden exile far from patients. The rest of the staff treated me with an almost fearful respect, as if I were some kind of witch doctor. I ignored the whispers. My only focus was Olivia. I spoke with her every day. As her strength returned, so did the light in her eyes. One day, as I was checking her pulse, she asked me in a clear, curious voice, "Dr. Vance, my dad told me you knew. That you knew what was wrong with me when no one else did. Why did you try so hard for me?" I looked at her, and in her face I saw the echo of my daughter's. "Because I made a promise to someone very special a long time ago," I replied softly. "I promised her I would find the answer, and you, Olivia, you are that answer." She smiled, not fully understanding, but feeling the truth in my words. The day she was discharged, Elian Croft summoned me to his office one last time. The room was the same, but everything had changed. I was no longer a pleading intruder, and he was no longer a king on his throne. We were two men bound by an experience that had broken and rebuilt us. "I owe you my daughter's life," he said, his voice resonating with genuine emotion. "That's a debt that can't be repaid, but I'm going to try. Ask for anything. A check with any number of zeros you want, a state-of-the-art research lab, an entire hospital with your name on the facade. It's yours." I looked out the window, at the city stretching out below us. For an instant I imagined that life, the prestige, the resources, the end of financial worries. It was every doctor's dream, but it wasn't mine. "Thank you, Mr. Croft," I said, turning to face him, "but I can't accept any of that." He frowned, confused. "Why not? You've earned it." "Because my mission was never about money or fame. It was for her." I took the worn photo of Eleanor from my wallet and placed it on the mahogany desk between us. All of this was to give meaning to her death, so that her story wouldn't end with a diagnosis of unknown causes. Elian looked at the photo of my daughter, and his eyes filled with understanding and a profound respect. "There's only one thing I want," I continued. "The only thing I want is for no other parent to have to go through what you and I went through. Help me create a foundation, a small one, no frills, dedicated to researching this syndrome and helping families who don't have your resources. And I want it to be named after my daughter." I paused. "The Elian Vance Foundation." Elian Croft didn't answer immediately. He stood up, walked over to me, and to my astonishment, he hugged me. An awkward hug, from a man not used to showing affection, but filled with a gratitude that broke me inside. "It would be an honor, Doctor," he said, his voice cracking. "It would be the greatest honor of my life." Today, a year later, I'm back in my small clinic. The smell of antiseptic and burnt coffee is still the same. The furniture is just as worn, but something is different. On my desk, next to Eleanor's photo, rests a small brochure. On the cover, a simple, elegant logo reads, "The Elian Vance Foundation, shining a light on hidden syndromes." This afternoon, the foundation will award its first research grant to a brilliant young geneticist. Tomorrow, we will help a family in another state get the diagnosis they have been denied. The echo of a small, truncated life is beginning to resonate, to heal others. I take out Eleanor's photo. Her smiling eyes seem to look at me as if she had always known this day would come. I stroke her paper face, and for the first time in 10 years, the pain in my chest is not an open wound, but a serene scar. "We did it, my love," I whisper to the silence of my office. "Your story didn't end that autumn afternoon. It's just beginning." And finally, my own promise, the one that has kept me standing through a decade of darkness, is fulfilled. My daughter, my little Eleanor, can now rest in peace.